Thank you for having me, everybody. So I spent a lot of time in a soil pit. I was thinking earlier today, the first soil pit I've ever dug was in my parents' front yard. I grew up on a farm in Iowa and they let me have it. So I had a soil pit in the front yard and I had an old cable spool in the backyard under a tree where we would steal tools out of my parents' kitchen and make mud pies and do things like that. And we had a huge garden. So I guess I maybe was just always destined to be a soil scientist, but I really enjoy soil pits. I'm going to explain why. So the premise here for today is that, somebody's going to ask you and say, hey, you know something about soils. Do you want to give a talk to our group? So maybe it's a youth activity, so FFA or 4-H or Envirothon, or maybe it's farmers, or maybe it's master gardeners, maybe it's environmental professionals or teachers, high school teachers, or any K through 12 teachers in general. But at the end, we're going to focus on a little bit more here, extension and people, and especially soil health is a big topic. But I'm seeing, a lot of companies doing soil pits at their field days as well. So this is a topic that anybody can do. And I just would say that a soil pit, whether that's in real life or in a video, is an excellent teaching tool. But that's not to say that samples or monoliths and other things are not good tools too. But I just really like a soil pit, and I'll explain why. So I learn more when I dig a hole. So my story, I've got a couple stories for you about poking into a soil. Like if you're poking into a soil with a soil probe or maybe a penetrometer or a ball probe or something, that only tells you part of the story. So this was near the town of Ellsworth, Kansas. So this is West Central. And a producer wanted to know if deep tillage would help a field or not. So I went out and checked it out. And this is, several years ago now. And I thought a penetrometer, that's a pretty good tool for that question, right? If somebody wants to know if there's a dense layer in their soil, you just push down. And if you sense the density going up, well, maybe then tillage is needed. So I say a penetrometer is a good tool for that, and sort of, but not really. It has limitations. So what affects penetration resistance? Well, structure, so that is compaction, right? But moisture affects it too, and texture affects it. So I ended up having to dig a hole anyway to see what was going on. And here, this is a person using my penetrometer that I have. So it's mostly in the ground already, and it's got a GPS unit up here on the bracket. But you can see that with this penetrometer, you don't get to see the soil. But this is in a field, obviously this was a cornfield. I had to dig this shallow soil pit by hand anyway. And so here's some of the tools. Had a knife and had a fabric tape, so you can get that, anywhere. It sells fabric, craft stores, whatever. And I dug a pit, and so I was just looking at what the roots were telling me. And I found platy soil structure. So I'm like, oh, well, as a soil scientist, I see plates in the soil. I know that means compaction. But then I sat there and spent a little more time with my little hole I had dug and saw all kinds of earthworms. So it wasn't until I spent that, 15 minutes or so really looking around to where I thought, if the earthworms are here, even though there's those plates, even though I could poke this with a penetrometer, once I saw the earthworms and I could see that through those plates, the earthworms were channeling and there were spores starting to form, really the best thing for that soil would have been to leave it alone. So that farmer had been no-tilling for a while, had a pretty diverse crop rotation. They didn't need to do deep tillage. But I'll tell you a story. They did do deep tillage, but they left some places, some passes where they didn't do deep tillage. Then they couldn't find it with the yield monitor later on. So that deep tillage operation was a big use of power and fuel, and it didn't gain them any yield for that particular one. I have another story for you. So at a field day, I poked my penetrometer into the soil because I didn't learn the first time. I poked my penetrometer into the soil and I thought aloud, wow, this field has some compaction in it. And because it was soft on top as I poked down, and I hit something hard, not like a rock, but something hard. So what can make a soil feel hard? Well, is it compaction, or is it a major increase in clay or maybe gravel, which is just an inherent soil property, meaning it inherited it. There's nothing you can do about an increase in clay or gravel. But in this case, it was actually because it had been very dry here in Kansas, been very dry. Then we got some rain. So the surface was soft, but the rest of the profile was dry. And the producer is probably still annoyed with me for thinking that his soil was compacted, because I remember he just, looked at me when I said, "Oh, wow, this is compacted." And it wasn't. I just had to dig that hole to know. I had to get there with actually looking at the soil. So now I leave my penetrometer in the office and I just dig a hole before I dig myself into any more holes with people. So the pros of digging a hole is it's the only way to get the whole story. And soil tests are good. So they do tell you about the chemical or biological properties. Those are things I can see earthworms with my naked eye, but I can't see anything about the total microbial biomass, or I can't tell you with my naked eye too much about bacteria or fungi. So those other tests are great. But digging a hole, you can really learn about the physical properties that you can and can't alter. So you can alter structure. You can make it worse or you can make it better. And texture really can't be altered. I mean, you can alter texture by importing a bunch of soil for an expensive building project, or you can put soil into that, better soil into your above ground gardening beds or something like that. But for a field, you really can't alter it. Of course, we can see earthworms. But the most important thing you can do is to see what the roots are doing. What are the roots telling you? Where are the roots? Are they normal? Are they stubby? Or are they flattened or discolored? Or do they look like mohawks? And, if you see, I was in a field the other day installing some soil moisture sensors, and I was looking at the roots of some corn plants, and it kind of looked like as we were popping them out, they were cracking, the sidewall was cracking, and like, oh, I was checking it out. But they didn't look like little mohawks. If you have really bad sidewall compaction, the roots will tend to grow in that channel, and they'll kind of look like the corn has mohawk roots. So that's what you need to do. That's the main point of the whole story. I want to have a safety moment though. Soil pits are a great teaching tool, but they can be deadly. Job site accidents do claim lives every single year. So before digging a hole, you're always supposed to call 811 dig safe, and they'll help locate utilities in the ground. And what to avoid. So sandy soils and wet soils both tend to collapse. They just don't have a lot of strength. You don't want to go too deep either. So as a general rule, about 5 feet is pretty good, but the less stable that soil is, you would want to go shallower. And then I like to keep one side vertical for a good face. So if this is going to be for a field day or a contest or something like that, I'll think about what time of the day is my event. If it's at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I'll think, where's the sun? Which direction is the sun going to be shining at? And that will be my good side. And then the other sides, I like to keep them sloped away. And then I like to make them T-shaped as well, so that people can get out and also people can see the soil better. People can, if you've got it T-shaped, the sun will hit it even better and they can see it even better. So almost all of them, I think about how I want to dig them. So the T-shape is great. I'm not actually going to do the overhead cam. I had thought about that, but basically you just dig your straight side first and then dig away from that to get the rest of the pit dug. So if you have a great big wide bucket, you could probably get your pit dug with one pass, but if you have a narrow bucket, you might have to do that back side first and then dig another pass over next to it and then dig your T-shape out. But for a pit, this is all assuming you're using an excavator, but for a talk with a landowner, farmer, landowner, somebody, just a one-on-one conversation, a shallow pit, 18 inches or 2 feet deep is a great discussion. Most of what a farmer could really change is in the upper 6 inches or maybe 12 inches anyway. So keeping one side vertical though to hang your tape measure on is a good thing. So you can really go down. Tools of the trade, something to dig with, a spade or a mini excavator is great. Probes and augers are okay. Probes are, the bigger the barrel on the probe, the better, because you can see more soil. Augers, I don't really love them because, it really churns up the structure. And if I want to break apart the PEDs and look for compaction or not, it's not as easy. But I understand that some soils, that's just what you have to use. Tape measure, like I said, the fabric sewing tape is good. Pit tapes are great, and I have some info at the end of the presentation. So those are those big wide ones that you see If you've ever seen soil contests or seen a lot of pictures on the internet, they'll have these big wide tapes, and I can tell you where to get those. Come from Nebraska. Then I like to use something to show the layers or point out interesting features. So golf tees, I like to get these as my little free things. You go to conferences and people have these sitting on the table. I pick them up and throw them in my backpack because then I like to use these and push them into the soil profile. So whether I'm using those to note horizons down the profile, or maybe I'm like, oh, here's a sweet plow pan and I want to put them horizontally across. Or sometimes you might see like a big badger burrow or something like that, and you can kind of dot the lines around with these. So they're really great. Roofing nails with plastic heads on them, the ones for holding down tar paper, also are great. So this is a sand dune pit from Nebraska, right along the Platte River. So there's not so many layers here. I don't know how many different things I would pick out if I was showing people this one. This soil is also really sandy, so it's one that doesn't have as much stability. So this pit was enormous. So in case this face fell off, people could just step back and get out of the way. Now these plastic strips here, these are just so that people don't pick inside that, because there was going to be a lot of kids looking at this pit, over the course of the week. No, you don't need these plastic tapes, but this is a lush soil in Nebraska, and it probably had about 5 different horizons. So the shadow is hitting this. So you can see in this last picture, this is straight on. The sun is hitting this perfect if you were having a field day. This one with the sun kind of coming and hitting it from the side a little bit, casts a little bit of shadow. It's not quite so perfect for photographing, but again, somebody has put a plastic roofing nail here at this horizon, but you could put, add them down the way. And that's something I like to do. So if you're one person and you're giving a talk to 20 or 30 or 50 people with a microphone or something, this can be interactive. You can sort of like move the T down the profile and say, where do you think I should put one of these? And the audience can sort of tell you. So you're like, just slide down and they say stop. And then you put a T in there. So you can make it interactive, even if it's a big group activity. This is a soil pit in Kansas, and you can see a lot of different layers here. In fact, you can see there's kind of a diagonal going on here, but right here where they hung the tape, they put a roofing nail here, a roofing nail here. So this is denoting, 1 horizon, 2 horizon, 3, 4, 5, and then there's this that looks like it might be getting into some bedrock here. So knife. We like to use something with a sturdy blade. These bare bones have gotten really, really popular lately. Don't need one quite this heavy duty, but Forestry Supplies also sells one called a soil knife, and most gardening stores actually sell a soil knife also. And the ones that I see at gardening stores I actually like because they've usually have like inches, marked down. And so they work really well for like, if you want to take a picture and put it on your Twitter account, of look at this, feature, and you want to measure how big it is. And then hunting knives also work well, but I don't want them to be overly sharp. So a brand new hunting knife, let it get dull, or maybe you're going to get a new hunting knife and you can use your old hunting knife for a soil knife. But a thick blade is good because you want to really stick these in and pry. They're kind of like mini spades. Let's see. So spray bottle that mists. I like to wet down one side of the profile because I don't know how many times I've stood there looking at a soil profile. I'm like, oh, there's an obvious layer. And just by looking at it, and I go pick at it, I'm like, that's not really. Sometimes if it's dry, like if the surface is wet and then you go down and it's dry, it might fool you and look like a layer when it's really just because there's a big difference in moisture. So I like to sometimes spray the whole thing to see what it looks like if the whole thing is wet. Clipboard, texture triangle, and pictures of different structure types are good to have to show people what you mean when you say granular or platy. And I've got that coming up in a second. 10% hydrochloric acid is good if you are in a dry state like me. So if you're in this column of states that Kansas is in or anything to the west, you'll probably have carbonates in your soil profile. If you want to make them fizz for the audience, it's a fun thing to do. And it's not anything that we can really change with management, but sometimes people will say, well, what's that? And then you can explain and show them, say, this is carbonates, and this is just something that naturally occurs in soils in drier places. And these are things you don't really need unless you want to describe the whole profile. But, color books. So this is kind of an old Munsell soil color book. So you can do that. You use these for matching up chips with pages. So that's more important if you're doing a full description as a permanent record. And there's also this book called the Field Book for Describing and Sampling Soils that's available as a PDF on the internet. And it's great for grabbing images out of, which I've done here on some further pages. So here's one of our soil judges from K-State he was just looked, I thought he looked really nice how he was showing you want to use these with the sun coming through the chips, and you hold a little piece of soil up and behind those pages and match it up. And that's done to give soils a very specific color name, which is important, especially if you were somebody whose job it was to map a wetland or determine if something was a wetland. Soil colors have a lot of importance in that realm. So, okay, so it's dug. Now what? Now what are we going to do? You're going to use the knife to pick off the smear marks from the excavator or your spade. And you can pretend to be an archaeologist when you do this. You're kind of working carefully, picking it off, not just whacking at it, but picking it off so that you can really see the soil, get rid of those smear marks, or put some kids to work and have them help you. And you can decide, are you going to pick out those layers ahead of time with your golf tees and your roofing nails, or is that something you want your audience to help you pick out? That can be interactive. And then, so what's the purpose of the soil pit? Why are you doing this? If it's a general, hey, let's learn about soils, then picking out horizons and discussing how the soil is formed. And if you're like, I don't really know how it's formed, reading up ahead of time about that site in Web Soil Survey is a great, that's like watching game film before a football game. You can study up on what that soil is going to be like. And you can explain to the audience how these properties that the soil has influences how the soil can be used. So I tend to dig a lot of soil pits in pastures that are shallow to bedrock. And I talk about the fact, well, these are shallow to bedrock, which is why they're pastures and they're not being used for cropland and things like that. Or, what would it be like if I tried to build a house in the soil? What would its limitations be? But if this is more about teaching a soil pit, I think I meant to say soil health there, then you're going to want to talk a little bit more about inherent versus dynamic properties. So inherent is things like, where did the soil come from? So this is just a map of mollisols. So you can see here in Kansas and in the Great Plains, we just have a lot of mollisols in general, which is good. Mollis is Latin for soft. So these are soft soils, good for cropland. And so there's these 5 soil forming factors, and that's something you could definitely talk about with your audience. So the soils are a function of climate and organisms and relief and parent material and time. But if you're going to talk, so inherent properties are inherited from the 5 soil forming factors. So things like depth to the bedrock and such. But dynamic properties are things that change, sometimes pretty fast. So soil structure inherits from, you get that from the 5 soil forming factors, but it can rapidly change by use and management, or from use and management. Porosity and density, which are also kind of related to soil structure. But if we break up all the natural beds that used to be there and then drive over them with heavy equipment, we can go from granular to massive pretty fast. You could do that even in one event if it was just the wrong moisture content. And organic matter, that's another one that it comes from thousands of years of formation, but we can change it pretty rapidly. So these are some cores. These are all from the same pasture. These are all from a field, and these are all from a pasture over the fence taken by one of my grad students a few years back, 10 years ago, I guess now. But we were comparing cropland versus grassland. And so here, the cropland was about 40 to 60% eroded relative to the adjacent pasture. So humans have become the 6th soil forming factor because we modify things so fast. We're so good at it. So soil health, which I know many people teach about now, is defined as the capacity of a soil to function. And that's about all I'll really say. But I see in here sustaining plant and animal productivity, maintain or enhance water and air quality. So for teaching about soil health, I like to focus on the big 3. So talking about texture and the fact that it's inherent, and understanding that texture often is not the same from the top of the soil profile to the bottom of the soil profile. But in understanding, well, how does that affect everything? How does it affect the water holding capacity, for example? Color, that's inherent too. It comes from the parent material, but what can we learn by looking at that? And then, as I said, structure, which is much more dynamic. So here's the pictures of the structure types from that book I was talking about, Field Book for Describing and Sampling Soils, which is available on the internet as a PDF. You can, I like to explain those major horizons, say, maybe I don't need to pick out 8 in that depth I'm looking at. Maybe I just look at the big 3 or 4 main different ones and I explain them. What am I seeing? And I like to spend extra time examining the soil structure in the upper part of the rooting zone. So maybe upper foot or upper 6 inches I focus on. So granular, that is one I would tend to see if I were to go dig a hole in my backyard, which is in a native grassland. Those aggregates there's a lot of organic matter there, and organic matter can help clump up into these little granules, like grape nut cereal, if anyone still eats that, Blocky, those are usually larger than granules, and they still allow water movement and air movement around. Platy is one, though. Platy, that can form naturally in forest soils. There can be some thin platy structures, thin platy horizons. But platy is also something that we can see as maybe a sign of compaction, as I showed earlier with my hands showing those plates. And massive is one that we can get that can be from, like if we had a flood today and it just deposited a whole bunch of silty material, we could have massive structure from fresh geologic material. But massive is also something that we can run into if a soil is compacted. So at the bottom of a pond, if you did intentional compaction, what you would find would be massive structure. But maybe on the end rows or right next to a entrance to a field, you could probably find some pretty massive structure if really heavy things are parked there often. So I like to really focus on structure when looking at a soil pit with people. Again, texture is inherent. So that's the sand, silt, and clay. And we can only change texture in small spaces. Or maybe on a construction project, if there's a lot of funding, you could bring in a lot of soil to improve something. But basically, so there's the texture at the surface, but again, thinking about how texture changes as we go down. So a classic one that's interesting in my state is there's a part of the state where we talk about clay pan soils. And maybe the surface has a nice silt loam structure or texture here, which is just perfect for growing plants. And you don't have to dig too far, and it's like you hit this wall, and there's an abrupt textural change, and you get into just pure clay, and it'll be like 60% clay. And it's just really interesting. And that affects everything. The ability for roots to get down into that heavy clay is not very good. The ability for those roots to go down and get what they need to do, being water or nutrients, is not very good. So it can really limit the uses of a soil like that. So just understanding what the texture is so important. Again, texture is not usually the same through the whole profile, and that's important to know. So in this one, there would be an increase in clay here in this lower part of the A, upper part of the B, and then it drops back off again in clay content. Can't see that by looking at it. I just know because I was there and I touched it. So color is the last thing I'm going to talk about. And so dark surface horizons, I think of those as a teeter-totter, a balance. So if you have dark soils, dark colored surface soils, that means that plants have grown for thousands of years, and they've grown and they've died. And most of the carbon is cycled back into the atmosphere from those plants. But a little bit gets stored in soil. And some of that becomes part of the soil. And if you repeat that cycle for hundreds to thousands of years, that's how you get an A horizon. So a thick A horizon. We have A horizons that are a couple feet thick in places in my state, which is a prairie. We had prairies. So where you have prairies, you have these dark colored horizons. But on average, cultivated fields have about half that carbon that never cultivated fields have now. And that's been lost from erosion. So whether that's wind erosion or water erosion, carrying it down to where it's at the bottom of ponds and reservoirs now. And some of that's from respiration. So that's like if you gave me a Red Bull and I had a whole bunch of energy for a while and I got a lot of work done, and then I kind of went dormant, and then feed it to me again. or tillage is kind of like that for soils, is that you fluff it up, you give the microbes that are there a lot of airspace to work with, and they get really active and they'll decompose more carbon than they would have if you didn't till it. So it's like that Red Bull, it gives them energy. So no-till and diverse crop rotations, cover crops, manure, compost, those are all good ways to put carbon back into soil. I didn't put biochar on there, but that's another one too everybody's interested in. So putting carbon back into the soil is a way to reverse that. Getting that thick A horizon that took thousands of years to get, if we want to store more carbon into soil, we have to try to put more in. So the more we try to put into the soil, the faster we can change the soil. But that's a big field of study. How fast can we change the soil? Lots of work happening now. So these are things I like to talk about, and sometimes I might try to show a comparison pit. So have one dug here or have one dug over there. If there's a different management or different slope or something, having a comparison pit. So these are some comparisons, although these were dug on different days and I took pictures on different days. So you can see the effect of the lighting. On the left here, this is full sun versus these two were taken on a grayer, cloudier day. We were out there, I think, in November doing this. And so, if you're going to do this and try to create a graphic or an illustration, you'd also want to probably spray them all with water so that they all had about the same soil moisture. But even so, I've got this little thin blue line drawn here. So you can see that's going through 1 meter, about 1 meter on all of these. And so this field here had about 50 centimeters of an A horizon before we get to this tan material. And both of these on the right had, more like 70 centimeters before we got into that tan material. So, they were all mapped the same. These are all mapped as a Keith silt loam. And so this is the kind of research I like to do and the comparisons I like to make. So with that, color, and I'll say this in the subsurface, just thinking about this. So this is at a road cut. This is how this one was able to be so tall. I wasn't in a pit, but the subsurface parent material, in this case, when it's well drained, a soil will have the color of its parent material. And poorly drained soils, they'll usually look gray because of iron reduction. And if they're somewhat poorly, they can be very, very colorful with both red and with gray splotches. So here's the info on that pit tape, and I'm going to leave that up while I turn it back over to Paul and Christina for question time.